Good
No, go ahead.
time of okay. Good time of day, whatever time of day it is where you are today, everyone. Today is the September 20th instance of the Gamma meeting. Unless you're like in Australia, in case I think it's the September 21st. I don't know, time zones are weird. Today, I'm looking up the wrong doc actually. Go ahead and add your name to the attendees section of the agenda. And please remember that this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and make sure that you are nice and making this a safe space for everybody to be as we are discussing. I think I didn't mention it yet, but if you have agenda items you'd like to have us discuss today, go ahead and add it. We currently have a fairly light agenda, but I imagine that we will be discussing things for a while. I wanted to start off, I've got the first and so far only agenda item. And what I wanted to do here is really just talk about, kind of take a step back. Before the recording started, Flynn mentioned something, mentioned about some two large Slack threads that were that are in the Gateway API channel. I just want to take a step back and kind of reiterate kind of the way that we're hoping to do work here in Gamma and contributing up to Gateway API.
I should probably point out, I think those were two really useful Slack threads.
Yes.
Yes. A lot of reading. Wow.
Yes, it's a lot of context. And the reason I want to bring this up is not because, to Flynn's point, it's not because those Slack threads were off base in any sort of way or unnecessary. Again, there's very useful information. But kind of as a matter of I guess focus and reiterating our goals. Everything that we are proposing here, as far as talking about service binding or meta representation, things like that, it's all within the experimental channel of Gateway API. And to a further extent, we are hoping to move quickly. We set that kind of at the outset of this, for lack of a better term, experiment with Gamma. And we're hoping to, like I said, move forward quickly and to iterate on the different approaches. And so this has been my lens as far as working on this, but I think that most will agree with me that if we get to a point where it doesn't make sense to continue in the same approach that we've been working on, then we will pivot to something that does make more sense. That's the beauty of the experimental channel, is that breaking changes are allowed. And so we aren't necessarily married to whatever we pick right now. What I am cautious of as a lead of Gamma is that we don't get so caught up in making something perfect that we don't end up making anything at all. There will always be another degree of another edge case to add on, another thing to get just right in API. But I just want to acknowledge that, we all write software for a living. I think there's a lot of value in trying to come to a consensus on a workable path, and then iterating on that path until it no longer makes sense to. So I'll say that and turn it over to anybody else who has comments, and then move on to an agenda item that was just added.
As probably the person who spent the most time objecting to things on the grounds that they're not API design, sure. Like I 100% agree. Like we need to get something done and try using it. It would be better than spending too much more time arguing about what it should be. I 100% agree. I do think that there's some stuff that is really important to keep in mind, but I think that it's probably less important to keep that in mind at this point than to try something and see how it works.
I guess I would add also one of the prevailing questions about one of the prevailing questions that showed up often in those Slack threads was to the tune of, right, so is the point of Gamma to be capturing a common API for things that people are already doing, or is the point of Gamma to be coming up with new things that people should be doing? And I could personally probably argue either side of that particular question, but I'm leaning towards API for things people are already doing. And as part of that, I'm leaning towards recognizing that even if we think the way the application developers think about Kubernetes is broken, it's the way they think about it, and it's the way they're going to continue to think about it. And so approaching this from the perspective of how are people thinking about these resources also feels really useful to me as well.
Yeah, like just again, as the primary person who's been objecting to a lot of this stuff, like I do think that I do agree. I think that you get one shot to sort of tell people that to change the way they're doing things a little bit. Yeah, but that one shot doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be right now, right? Like, you can re-educate people a bit about things. That was what we had to do with Gateway, right? Like, it's a pretty big change from Ingress to Gateway. You get one sort of big change coin like that to spend. It probably does make sense to sort of start out with something that's less of a big change coin to start with, and try it out and see. Like, as you're all very aware, like I have worries about making the API like extensible by doing stuff some of the ways that we've been talking about, but I don't think that I should be the one that gets to be like, no, you can't do that. And so, yeah.
I think we should just, give you the objector in chief title, Nick, and just go ahead and formalize that, shall we?
Yeah, sure. I can handle that. So one other thing I should be clear on though is one of the reasons I've been objecting about this is some of this stuff is that I have had to get an API past the upstream API machinery reviewers, and a lot of the objections I am making are the ones that they will make. So, be aware that that you're going to need to make good cases for some of the stuff that you're talking about. If it doesn't fit in under the API guidelines, then you're going to need to have a really good reason why it doesn't. And that's where we are going to need to do that. Sorry, and that's not a reason not to do it, but it does mean that we need to keep that in mind as a cost.
It's a good call out. This popped into my head because of some reading I was doing the past couple of days. Chris Nova had an article about imperfect systems and the inevitability of imperfect systems. And there is a quote in there that more applies to engineering teams, but I think has consequence for what we're doing here. So it's kind of similar to a point that Flynn, I think, made a second ago, to design systems for the army that you have, not for the army necessarily that you want. There are a lot of things I think that if we could go back to Kubernetes pre 1.0, if we could change some things, then we could, then we would. But for better or for worse, there are lots of people who depended upon the API as it stands. And there are patterns for using those things. And we've got to design for the army of implementations that exist today, at least it's my perspective. Doesn't mean that we should completely forget about correctness. I appreciate a lot of the objections that Nick has raised, because I think it's important to talk about them and to go through that process of weighing something that might be more technically correct versus something that might have a smooth user experience. Trade-offs are the name of the game for what we do. So I value that exercise. But I also think that it's important to remember that users are imperfect, and their CI/CD pipelines are imperfect, and are likely going to be imperfect, and there are going to be any number of imperfections that exist in the consuming systems, and that's something that we need to be aware of. Any other thoughts, comments before we go to the next topic? All right, Mike, you've got the floor with a proposal.
All right. So yeah, I guess over the past couple weeks, we've gone through, we've shared the HTTP root mesh binding get proposal document. Thanks. And I've gone through recently and tried to clean up some of the existing comment threads, trying to clarify some of the goals and non-goals, from suggestions that seem to have mostly reached consensus. And after discussing with Keith and John as the co-leads, we want to propose to move forward with the direct binding to service with the parent ref field. There's a few. I guess like we want to acknowledge that the other proposal that has strong consideration is introduce a new resource, mesh service or something similar. But there's a couple of reasons why we think that even though it may be a little bit controversial, we think that kind of the balance of the trade-offs lends itself more towards the direct binding to service. So to start with, kind of one of, to reflect kind of Flynn's point, was that we think this most accurately reflects how users conceptually think of the way that services relate to each other in the mesh currently. And then also from the user perspective, this was the most direct way to support a transparent proxy implementation. While it may be possible to hijack a host name or hijack a service through something else, it would potentially introduce a lot more layers of abstraction and make it harder to reason about where that configuration is happening. And then finally, one of the nice benefits of this is that it's flexible, where it does not require any immediate changes to HTTP root. It does not require us to figure out how to do experimental fields on HTTP root, and it's extensible such that if at some point we do want to transition to a front-end role new object, we have the ability to do that by just adding support for a new thing rather than having a breaking change of any sort. So yeah, I've gone through and cleaned up the document, and I'm currently working on adding some of the context to the mesh service. I think ultimately the issue that mesh service is trying to solve is an upstream concern with an overloaded service resource. And really the best long-term way to solve that is probably an upstream cap. And the approach that we're proposing with direct binding service, it would minimize the churn, but not foreclose the possibility of us moving to something like that if it has promise and traction upstream. So that's kind of a mouthful. It's a high level summary of kind of where we're at, where we landed, why. And I want to first just take questions from Flynn and then from the Rob, Louis, and Nima room.
Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, when you say move forward with this proposal, what exactly do you mean by moving forward?
Making this into a actual get rather than just a Google Doc. So I'll open an issue in the Gateway API repo, assign an actual get number to this thing, and bring it back to the upstream Gateway API weekly meeting.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, for the record, I need to read this more carefully since my life has been a little complex for me the last couple of weeks, but on the face of it, I would say, yeah, let's do it. Bearing in mind everything that we've been talking about just recently about the perfect being the enemy of the good and wanting to kind of nail something down that we can all play with and really see, okay, how does it help us or how does it hinder us?
Cool.
Hey,
Hey, Rob.
I think I'm next. So I just wanted to understand, I should back up a second and say I am excited to see progress here. And I agree with everyone. Can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. We just should move forward with something. With that said, I am curious, right now, I think you're describing a parent ref of a service, and, theoretically a parent ref could be some other thing. One of the things I've thought of, and I'm imagining others, is what if the parent ref is a gateway at some point, but that is intended for mesh consumption? Or how do you make sense of that?
Sorry, Rob, did you say the parent ref being a gateway, but it's still intended for mesh consumption?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure I heard that correctly.
Like, let's just go, a couple years down the road and imagine that we have a gateway class cluster IP.
Yeah.
And if we do that, any number of reasons that you may want to have a different kind of parent ref. Another idea is service import, other things like that. How do you know that the parent ref is like this route is for mesh?
So yeah, like one of the things that we're not proposing to implement yet, but could be a way to help disambiguate that in the future if needed, is adding a second parent ref. So right now, parent ref, it accepts multiple references or multiple object references. You can define a ref to a service and a ref to a mesh representation object if we find that to be necessary. That also, like, I think it would be helpful to, like, in the context of thinking about mesh gateway implementations or service import, like, what are the specific use cases that they're intended to model, and how, like, what's the role that HTTP root plays in that? So yeah, if like, yeah, I'm just saying, like, there's definitely I like, one of the ones that jumps to mind for me is like egress functionality, and that may bind to an egress gateway in a mesh implementation or something like that. But I'll turn it over to John if you have answers while I'm kind of thinking through things.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I kind of agree with, to some extent, with what Rob said. Like, I do think that, one, we should make some forward progress. So I'm perfectly fine with going with this for now. But I was actually hoping to bike shed a bunch on, like, now that we have agreement that we're going to attach to the service as like a concept, which is a huge agreement to have. Well, I mean, tentative agreement, but sure. Like, the actual syntax of that, like, that's easy. Just go throw up a doc, have 10 options, bike shed the hell out of it and vote on it, whatever. And we don't necessarily need to block on that, but I think we could, reasonably resolve that in a short period of time. It might be useful. We could certainly go with this and then do that afterwards, though. You could lay out the concerns, like Rob said, of, what if the line becomes more blurred between mesh and gateway? What if gateways represent, services, that type of thing? There's also kind of future-looking things like, okay, we need to represent a host name. Like, how do we do that now, right? So there's all sorts of things that are relevant, and I was hoping to have written that doc before I came here, but now I can just talk about it conceptually. So I was hoping to write that, but maybe I'll do that afterwards, and we can go over it later.
I think it goes so far as to say that it feels like we probably should not block on all of the syntax discussions, but that we should definitely have those syntax discussions.
I think you're up next, Austin.
Yeah, Austin.
Yeah, just so I think the important decision here is that parent ref will be what we are attaching to, and service is probably the most common and the most important to move forward with. And later on, vendor specific or we can attach to other things like gateway class, like Rob was mentioning. We can attach to whatever else we find necessary. I mean, stateful set is one important case that we need to address at some point. But just like we did with HTTP route versus TCP route and other things, I mean, one is kind of moving forward because it's very common and very useful, and the others can, kind of lag a bit behind and wait for vendors to think more about what other parent refs may be. But the important thing is parent ref is object that the route is attaching to, and is no longer the mesh. So we will, if we ever need to support multiple meshes, we may need an alternative way to indicate that a particular route belongs to a particular mesh, I think. But we agree to postpone this, so it's not a problem.
Richard?
Yeah, so a couple of questions. First one is I just want to make sure I'm understanding the proposal correctly. So routing is going to be done based on the kubedns name of the service that's referenced from the parent ref. Is that right?
Yes.
Is any other information within the service going to be used, or just the DNS name for it?
I should add a section to be more explicit about the behavior if backend refs are not defined. It may default to sending traffic to the backend, to like the endpoints of the parent ref service. I should add that.
And then one other thing. So one use case that I've seen people have for meshes is having multiple meshes within their system. So they might have like a prod mesh, staging mesh, dev mesh, right? And within their control plane, they keep them sort of fenced off. So certain data plane clients will do sort of wildcard queries, and they'll get all listeners corresponding to a particular scope. I don't see any mechanism within this proposal for sort of fencing things off into one domain, whether it's prod, staging, dev. Is there any way that you would recommend doing that? Because the issue that I could see is now you have sort of a blast radius of an entire Kubernetes cluster rather than a particular configuration scope.
So Richard, to confirm, you're saying that you've seen a common pattern of people running multiple instances of meshes within the same cluster?
Yeah.
And I think we discussed it in the past, and we agreed to postpone this discussion about how we fragment or have multiple meshes until a later point. And it's orthogonal to this. I mean, there will be a mechanism. Istio has the sidecar import. I mean, there are mechanisms to do it without being tied to route. It doesn't have to be an HTTP route itself.
But me personally, I would absolutely love it if you'd hit me up on Slack and talk some more about those use cases, because I have not seen those use cases, and so I would love to hear what you're seeing.
I see. Okay, I will do that.
Cool.
I also I should have followed up on the service DNS name. I mean, there's sort of a suffix implicit to kubedns, right? So I guess that means that it's not possible to configure an arbitrary host name. Is that correct?
Yes, that's intentionally out of scope of this proposal. I'm considering that, or we're considering that as like egress functionality to basically like redirect to arbitrary host names.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I think I do have a slight concern on that front as far as like a custom trust domain, trust domain is not the right word, but like a custom suffix. Because there are, I know of, run into it several times of customers who have like a accordion-esque rule to redirect cluster.local to something else. That feels like something that is distinct from egress. And is something.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and Costin's comment in chat. Yeah, I think that would just be something to be explicit, or like don't hard code cluster.local. Like if it's reconfigured to something, support that reconfiguration. Basically, the intent is that it will work with transparent proxy for existing Kubernetes DNS references in a vanilla cluster, however that may be configured.
One of the, you know, don't want to be the objection guy, but like one of the things that I think is really important here is that to remember is that having anything keyed off an unstructured string inside a field, inside a resource, inside Kubernetes it's a really bad API smell, right? And a host name is an unstructured string, right? Like having to impute structure onto a string to make it structured, like effectively structured, is a really bad idea, right? Like, and yeah, that's why I have always been like, no, don't use host name. That's the sort of the rule that I'm taking that from, is you need to pull that data apart and structure it somehow, and then use the structured data as the thing that you're keying off, not the unstructured data.
Yeah,
so
and that's hopefully one of the benefits of having that direct object reference to service rather than the implicit lookup from a service host name or something like that. Back to Keith.
Yeah, and cost and services in chat before I can get my hand up fast enough. But as far as the host name field that's on HTTP route, is that in scope for this proposed change as kind of a secondary? And what are the semantics around it? If so, is it a secondary match? Are we excluding that for mesh completely? I think we need to be explicit about that, the HTTP use case.
I will say that it is explicitly included as an OR case, as like OR handling. So like it should not extend the scope of what that HTTP route targets. I am open to considering it as an AND case to narrow that scope. I'm not as familiar with that. If somebody else is interested in contributing that functionality to this proposal. But yeah, I think just, I want to avoid focusing on the egress case is kind of the intent here.
Yeah, my thinking was, and I don't think this is non-controversial, but is that like a parent ref of service means that we're matching on traffic to that service. Now, what does that mean exactly? There's really two ways to do it: host name or IP address. IP address seems strictly more correct to me, and it gives consistent behavior across all the different route types, right? So if we were to say that the parent ref service means that we're actually going to match the cluster IP, and that's how we know that it's actually going to the service, then the host name is still completely valid, right? The typical use case, you're not going to match on, it becomes just a header match essentially. Typically, you're not going to do a header match on top of that for the host header. But in theory, you could. Maybe it's like this backend is Nginx and that, you know, serving multiple vhosts. It's uncommon, but I suppose you could. But then I think the semantics around like gateways with listeners is very well preserved. The matching logic in the actual proxy is fairly straightforward, and I believe some implementations are already doing exactly this today. But I think that's what makes sense to me. But at the very least, we need to be very, very explicit on you know, what this actually means, like at runtime. Eventually, that will be a conformance test, but in the short term, as part of the gap.
Cool, thanks. Liwen, thank you next.
Yeah, so I have comments. I know, you know, at least what I hear from my customers, like multi-cluster is here. Everyone multi-cluster, right? You know, when people recommend, you know, you want serialized architecture, you don't want the one cluster go infinitely, right? So how do we deal with this? I mean, is our API, this Gamma API, is going to be forward-looking? At least it works in a multi-cluster case?
Yeah, in my opinion, and maybe this hasn't been spelled out clearly, but when at any point where we say service, we're not talking just capital S service, but we're talking about general service representations, of which there is service and service import as part of Kubernetes already. And, you know, vendors may have custom ones, but the service import part already kind of takes care of the multi-cluster, right? That would allow matching on, you know, multi-cluster services.
But what if I have one, you know, as you know, I serve service kind of overloaded, right? If I'm in my service, but really my service has a backend in both clusters. How do you represent that, right? I just, have the example, I think that's my, I
No,
think,
I think I think it's a really good question. And my like initial, I think it would be good to explicitly add that as part of the step too, just like how that could be implemented. So I think like my initial consideration is service import is a perfectly valid backend ref to be able to redirect traffic following the service import rules, which I believe. God, I forget the exact implementation, but like targeting the service ref should be able to forward traffic to either to that instance. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up, to the instance of that service within the cluster, or if it does not exist within the cluster, to a different cluster in the cluster set. Based on how that service import DNS resolves, I think is what it should do. I'm a little fuzzier on if service import should be allowed as a parent ref, because I think like the typical case is the service owner who is like producing that service should be configuring the like traffic splitting and routing rules for it, like after it passes through that layer of indirection, rather than having the consumer configure it.
okay.
Right? Yeah. But I think short answer, service import as a backend ref is totally valid.
I see.
Clear?
A couple of things. One of them is I have been trying to keep up with notes on this discussion.
Thank you.
Mike, in particular, you might want to take a look at that and see if I've badly misrepresented anything. It definitely feels to me reasonable to be able to support having one backend ref of a service and one being a service import to split traffic across clusters if you want to do that. It also feels completely reasonable to me that the host name should end up being a header match for the authority of an HTTP request. It's much less clear to me how you would handle that sort of a header match being an or instead of an and. And I'm not really sure what that would mean to say it's an or. It's really clear what it means to say it's an and.
I think we should, is the short answer.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, just a quick thing, coming back to the parent ref point, service import is the thing that causes the VIP to be allocated in the cluster. So if I was the owner of the service import in the cluster, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to treat it as a service declaration and attach to it. I think they're logically the same thing.
Okay.
Right, so that's as the producer of the service import, right? Not as the consumer.
Okay, yeah. Got it. Thank you for that clarification.
All of the other discussion aside, it really does feel like the thing that I have got the most out of all of this discussion to be like is the importance of the distinction between the front end and the back end of the service resource, the Kubernetes service resource, capital S. And the other thing is about the distinction between the producer and the consumer of any particular service, lowercase s, meaning an application, right? Like those are the two like critical distinctions I think that are really important in that you've got to consider for all of this mesh stuff, is that, you know, like that, yeah, that we didn't have to for Gateway, right? Like that, yeah, it was a bit simpler. And look, that was still really complicated. So
I was also going to say that kind of along that line, the discussion about host name in the other sense, where you're trying to figure out how to deal with egress, I think is going to be really interesting in the near future. Yeah. So I feel like the egress case is, yeah, there are too many cases that I've run across of people who want to use either the ingress or the mesh to talk to things that are outside of the cluster. And so I think we should tackle that at some point soon.
Yeah, yeah. We're not egress cases, but we're already running into that with constant implementation of services off the cluster within the mesh. So yeah, there's definitely concern for approaching that at some point, but thankfully not in this immediate scope.
Yeah, let's not do that right now.
One thing that I would suggest though that you make sure you include in the gap is that you split out what types of service of the Kubernetes service resource can be used as a parent ref. Can you use an external name as a parent ref? Can you use a load balancer service as a parent ref? Can you use
There's a note in the
what is a
doc
parent
of clarify exactly what kinds of resources can be parent refs and backend refs.
Yep. So I think that those are just like, I don't really mind. Like, again, I'm not going to object to any of this because I've done enough objecting, but like, I think it's really important to call out, like, to make something implementable, that it's really important to call out which things should be, like, which things are valid parent refs and which ones we're going to be like, that will never be a thing. That one might be a thing, but it's too hard and we're going to do it later. Right? Like, I think cluster IP is the obvious one where, yeah, we all understand that that's probably the one we're mostly talking about, but the other ones are ones where you just need to make a call now to rule it definitely out of scope or in scope or deferred.
Cool. We can definitely add that. I think stack goes Rob, then Keith, then Costin.
Cool. I just wanted to understand just, I think we've had this conversation in the past and I've lost track of what the conclusion was, but is there ever a goal for the same route to apply to a gate? Like, would you ever have a gateway and a service in the same set of parent refs for the same route? With the intention that the same routing configuration is used for both?
I have thought about it, and while this doesn't explicitly rule that out, I think I've kind of struggled to come up with a like practical use case where it would be desirable.
Is the equivalent traffic splitting east-west versus ingress? Like, I think I've seen that, but rarely. Like,
I don't know.
quite rarely.
Yeah.
So equivalent meaning the case where you want to have both the ingress and the mesh splitting traffic?
Same way, based on the same rule.
Yeah, so that case I would hope could eventually be implemented through basically some form of route delegation of interoperability between the North-South Gateway API and Gamma. So if a service that is defined as a backend ref on a HTTP route that is bound to a gateway, if that service also has an HTTP route referencing it as a parent ref to configure a mesh split, then yeah, I see Rod pretty a little bit. So like that is a possibility that is listed as a may in this, rather than trying to have a single route bind to two different things.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. I think that's all I had. I just would emphasize here that it seems like we should have a very narrow starting point with a lot of maybe as extension points, because there's so many different directions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keith and then Costin.
So I raised my hand before Rob's question, and now I can't stop thinking about Rob's question. So I've effectively forgotten what I was going to ask. I remember. I put this in the chat. Is there a list of acceptable backend ref kinds in upstream gateway API? And if so, can we lean on that for Gamma, or can we, or maybe for parent ref or backend ref or some sort? It just feels like there are perhaps now 3 different cases for service type resources used, and I can imagine it being confusing for a user to be like, oh, you can use a node port service here, but not here, but not here. So that's probably worth a chart somewhere fully like a matrix fully showing when each type of service kind or service type, two distinct things, showing when those are appropriate for which field. Do we have something like that upstream that we can kind of add? And if not, is it worth creating something like that for the ingress case?
I think in the backend ref field, we say it defaults to service, but aside from that, there are no rules, right? Like, and anything other than service is implementation specific support. So, that's the sort of the rules we have, right? And so, that's why I made the call out about types. I know for when I was maintaining Contour, like we specifically ruled out having external name types of services backend refs because it's concerning for that use case. But like, there's nothing that stops you doing that, right? Like we haven't written any rules like that into the spec.
Awesome. Thanks.
So I raise the same problem on gateway subsets. In Istio, we have the traffic splitting and the very frequent case of upgrading. Do we want to have any restrictions on so for example, if you have a service with a label selector, do we want to restrict that backend refs are subsets of that particular service, which would mean that it's a strict traffic split for that particular service, or do we want to allow the backend refs to be completely arbitrary destinations and only allow arbitrary destinations if there is not selector? So or do you want to add an additional field or some way to indicate that the semantics of traffic split versus arbitrary, the service used to be foo.cluster.local and suddenly it's starting to go to arbitrary other namespaces or be split to other services?
There seem to be a lot of cases where people would want to use arbitrary routing.
Yeah, but do we want to explicitly select it to be explicit in the API, either by putting a condition if it has selector or not, or some explicit field, or do we want by default to be always arbitrary? Because as an implementation, sometimes it's good if we have the user intent to be a traffic split, because it has impact on how we kind of implement it and how we I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'd personally lean towards not dictating policy at that level. And if the user wants to use it as an A/B split, as opposed to like A/B in the sense of, oh, do the users like this implementation better than this implementation versus load balancing traffic split versus canaries, I think all that stuff is fair game and we should allow it.
Yeah, I think just kind of piling on to that, I think I agree with that approach that you never know what kind of service might exist. One of the examples I've heard of is a selectorless service, in front of two actual services with selectors for the version. That seems valid to me. Taking a step back, what I originally raised a hand for was the idea of what services are supported in which cases. And it feels like what we really are looking for is a set of characteristics, right? So a service that has a front end, going back to Nick's comment, everyone's comment about, a service that has a front end, a cluster IP assigned to it is really all that we could have as a parent ref. And then as a backend ref, we need just a set of endpoints, and external name doesn't really qualify for that, but most other things do. We do need to write that down somewhere, but
yeah, I think it's any service that has one or many IPs.
yeah, you're right.
Right, it's not limited to one.
Yeah,
Right, because we can capture all of them.
One
Yeah.
or more, yeah.
yeah.
An IP, possibly many IPs.
Commonly one, maybe, but
Yeah, that's that one or more is one of my favorite spec writing tricks.
one IPv4 and one IPv6 address.
Yeah. Yeah,
Come
one
on,
or more
let's
IPs
not-
also lets you handle dual stack without having to rewrite your spec.
All the multi-net.
But come on, Olivia, let's not get crazy here.
Isn't Kubernetes getting crazy here anyway? So
Yeah, I think this is all crazy town. Like nothing we're doing here is all crazy town. So
I mean, in theory, you could do that with any unambiguous like network address, right? Not even IP, right? Like you could, in theory, if there was ever.
Yeah, let's build some IPX, baby.
There we go. Domain sockets. File names. Yeah, maybe I should start.
So long as nobody starts talking about X.25.
Cool. So I've dropped a handful of to-do notes into the middle of the service resource parent ref approach. I will follow up on those after this meeting, and there's a few that I would definitely appreciate some help with, such as the specific types of service, if somebody feels up to adding a paragraph or bullet points on those.
Mike, there are some things in the notes that I stuck in the meeting notes doc that amounts to to-dos.
Awesome.
And,
I'll grab those too.
You know, feel free to ping me on Slack if I can help out with stuff.
I will definitely take you up on that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Not gonna lie, before tomorrow, like tomorrow is packed, but maybe later in the week I'll be able to help out with
Later in
stuff.
the week sounds good.
Yeah. Cool.
All right.
I would guess the last thing that I wanted to call out as just being a thing to keep in mind is to make sure that I think it's better to be extremely arbitrary about like who owns what, you know, like making it so that you can only attach to services. HTTP route and service that are attached have to be in the same namespace. Don't try and be clever with cross namespace references yet. Just be really like this whole system has to be all in the same namespace. End of story. No cross namespace support to start with, because doing cross namespace things is very difficult,
Nasty.
really tricky and nasty. And so just make it be all of these things have to be in the same namespace. Specifying a namespace other than the namespace that one of them is in is an error. Is the place to start.
Yeah, we've got that nail on the goals from some of the threads that we reached consensus on. So that is clearly established of keeping that all within a single namespace now.
And if you want multiple namespaces, there is gateway already. Type internal. There is no need to handle it ourselves.
All right. Well, I think I'll turn it over to whoever's next on the agenda then. John, do you have some questions?
I think that
I can't
next
talk.
steps for who's creating the PR, clearly that sounds like Mike.
I can do it. Yep.
The PR goal of whether to merge quickly and iterate or iterate on the PR. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess that we should probably try to iterate quickly in the PR until it makes sense to stop and give ourselves permission to do multiple PRs afterwards.
I think in terms of like admin stuff, it feels fine to me to get the GEP to an implementable state, not an accepted state, so that then like people can implement things and we can have like be like, hey, this is it's implementable and experimental, and that way people can like try it out and see how it goes. Because this doesn't need a lot of changes to HTTP route, that dodges a lot of the problems that we might have to have about adding experimental fields, or do we need to add a new resource and what group is it in, all that sort of stuff. Like, so, that is the biggest advantage of the approach that we're proposing here, is that we don't need to do like field level or resource level changes to already existing Gateway API resources, right? Like, let's putting this to implementable, and then having it be like, okay, now everyone have a crack at this and see how you go. Feels to be like effectively, it lets us do like a POC of how this will work, but a community POC, right? Like, and that feels like a big win. Personally, for me, like I don't want to go too far down this road, but one of the things we need to discuss at some point is when we actually do end up releasing things for this, we need to discuss, do these things live in the same API group as the Gateway API things? Because maybe they shouldn't, right? Like, they're going to be different things. So like, that question should not be discussed or answered right now. I just wanted to put that in your head for something that you need to think about so that we can talk about it later. But marking this as implementable, not accepted, or whatever the exact state of the GEP is, means that people can iterate quickly. It's accepted that this is like, hey, way experimental. Even this is more experimental than experimental.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really good to me. And yeah, just like for concrete things like the questions that were raised in this meeting to kind of like give clarification on, are we thinking about this? Are we not? Are there specific constraints that we should add? That kind of stuff is really helpful. And I definitely do want to include that in kind of like the Get PR. The things I don't want to do is like reopen bike shedding on, is this the right approach at all?
Look, as the primary devil's advocate, chief objector guy, right? Like I feel like I can definitively say, look, trust me, if you've got objections, more than likely I've raised them. But like, and we've decided that we're going to go ahead with this anyway because like we need to do something to see how it works, and that's the thing. So like, look, like I do want to say sorry to make this have taken a long time, but I do think that the discussion has been worth it. Like, so. And this is me publicly being like, yes, I'm objector in chief. I'm ceasing to be objector in chief for now. And in the interest of trying something out and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Cool. Well, I appreciate it. And the feedback's definitely helped us think through this thoroughly and kind of get to something that feels like a good proposal. So thank you.
Nicely done, Mike, putting that together too.
Thanks. I had a lot of help. So. Keith, next steps.
Yeah, so John's made me want to put this bug out in folks' ear. We mesh representation and service binding were kind of our top level goals in the short term to try to get knocked out. It sounds like with the mesh representation, with the service binding approach that we've taken, there's not yet a need for a mesh representation resource, which might even be counted as a win, less competition to have. But I want folks to start thinking about, what do you want to tackle next? Speaking from my use case, we have a pretty big need around policy, specifically authorization policy. We're migrating from SMI. And so there is currently a gap around that in the state of the spec. So I'd like to spend some time doing that. I also believe that we might be at the point, once this gap gets accepted, that we can start doing parallel streams of work, which is very exciting. So start thinking about what sorts of things you need to see from Gamma / Gateway API to really implement this for your implementation, and bring those to the next meeting. Or actually, I'll scratch that, put them in Slack, and we can start seeing where folks have investment from there. So that's all I want to say about that. I'll turn it over to Rob.
Hey, yeah, mine is really short. I mentioned this in the meeting yesterday, but there's a Contrib Summit at KubeCon. We're hoping to get a chance to meet with everyone in person, talk through some of these things, do some brainstorming, whatever. So if you can make it, we'd love to see you. If you're not an org member yet, but you want to make it, reach out to one of us maintainers and we can help get you there.
Yeah, Rob or I both can approve people who want to become org members, and that fulfills the 2 separate organizations requirement. So
when is the Contributor Summit?
it is on the Monday before KubeCon starts.
Probably.
So, yeah, so there are 2 days pre-events. I know lots of people have other events on those days. My experience with the Contributor Summit has been, it is by far the most useful thing that I do at KubeCon, by far. And in terms of like actually getting work done and learning about like what's actually happening in Upstream Cube. So if you are in this call, I would strongly encourage you to do your best to try and come to the Contributor Summit if you don't already have something clashing on the Monday.
Rob, I think I saw something on the Gateway API meeting yesterday, and I may have just missed it, but did we get a talk to Gateway API, get a talk submitted that we can be looking to attend at Contrib Summit?
Yeah, we formally submitted a couple things. One is just an hour-long working session, and the other is a talk about our experience developing CRDs, that kind of stuff. So, and others are welcome if you have more ideas. I'm sure we can get time.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that there's a unconference section of the day too. So even if you don't get anything beforehand, like it's possible to say like, Gamma / Gateway API as an unconference topic and end up with a discussion session in during the day as well. But it would be better to try and submit something beforehand if possible.
All right, thanks. Strange, I think I started moderating this and then Mike did a really smooth job of kind of stepping in there and managing everything. So appreciate it. And thank you, Flynn, for working on notes and keeping our minutes up to date. Really appreciate the effort and all the discussion as well. Love working with you all. We will be meeting again on the 27th at 8 a.m. Pacific. Thank you, and y'all have a great rest of your weeks.
Y'all too.
Thanks, y'all.